The Empathy Table is an Ideos podcast. We believe empathy can shape and influence the ideas for solving some of our world's greatest challenges. Both ideas and empathy begin with a story, and stories are often shared around a table. Pull up a chair. Welcome to the table.
Welcome to the inaugural Food for Thought conversation, a special edition of the Empathy Table Forum and video podcast. I am Ideos President Christy Vines. Thanks so much for being with us today. The Empathy Table brings into conversation Christian thinkers, leaders, and practitioners with one primary goal: to build empathy and connection in pursuit of solutions to some of our world's most intractable and polarizing issues. And we do that through the sharing primarily of stories and ideas. As the world continues to wrestle with the effects of COVID-19 and the ongoing pandemic, in particular, the effects of quarantine and the impact of social distancing norms, a new conversation is beginning to emerge. One that is centered around the idea of how we emerge from quarantine, how we emerge from being socially distanced from one another for so long. In addition, there's an equally important conversation, a conversation about the future and how we will live in a post-COVID-19 era. In particularly, is there a possibility of living well in that future? This latter idea is the focus of Food for Thought. How we as the church can reflect on the lessons we are learning during this pandemic, and also what the process looks like in seeding a future worth having. A future worthy of this sacrificial and extraordinary moment. And we want to capture not only the lessons we are learning from this crisis, but the pivots we will need to make to ensure that we will emerge from this with a design for the creation of this better future. And so this is the first of 8 conversations to help us think well about these issues. And to help kick us off, I am joined by 3 extraordinary and talented friends and thinkers in a discussion about the topic of co-creation and the pursuit of a future worth having.
First, we have Andy Crouch. Andy is an author and partner for theology and culture at Praxis, an organization that works as a creative engine for redemptive entrepreneurship. Hi, Andy.
Hello, Christy. Great to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Next up, I've got the Reverend Kristen Farrington. Kristen was previously the executive director of the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum Institute in Washington, D.C. She's currently the assistant chaplain at St. Stephen's and St. Agnes School in Alexandria, Virginia. Hi, Kristen.
Hi, Christy. So nice to be here.
Glad you could join us. And our final guest is Dave Evans. Dave is the co-founder of the Stanford Life Design Lab, co-author of Designing Your Life and Designing Your Work Life, and a venture partner at Praxis. Hi, Dave.
Hey, Christy. Good to be here.
Good to have you. So we're going to start with Andy. I'm pitching a question to you, but Dave and Kristen definitely feel free to jump in. But this is in response to, obviously, to COVID-19 and its far-reaching impact. Praxis recently came out with an article, which Andy, you co-authored, titled Leading Beyond the Blizzard: Why Every Organization is Now a Startup. And it establishes a framework for how we might view this current moment. And just to give kind of those listening who haven't read the article a little bit of an insight, the framework identifies 3 seasons that you identify as blizzard, winter, and ice age to help us better evaluate this unique moment in time. So what I'm wondering is, even as the states here in the US and other countries around the world begin to slowly open back up, what are the most important signposts that you all are seeing that lead you to believe that we are in an ice age moment, or a small ice age, as you put it, Andy? And from your perspective, what good can come from an ice age moment such as this?
Yeah, great question. I think there's a very natural hope that this was just a passing storm and we're almost done and we're ready to go back outside again, which would be the blizzard model. Or maybe worst case, it's going to be a few months. I think a lot of people now are thinking that way. But I think there are reasons to think that this will have kind of lasting effects on, in a sense, the climate that we're in, because the ice ages that have come and gone in geological history are, they're actually not based on huge variations in temperature. There was one called the Little Ice Age. It's the most recent one that ended in the early 19th century. And it only involved a decline of about 2 degrees Celsius in average global temperatures, which is not very much, you might think. But it actually changed the conditions of agricultural life, economic life, social life in the Northern Hemisphere for centuries. Now, I don't think we are looking at a centuries-long effect from this particular pandemic. I don't see many reasons to think that. But it's going to be, I think, more than a season. Winter sounds like a few months, and then we'll be done. And I think there's many reasons to think it will be more than that. And it really comes down to a somewhat of a guess on our part at this point of just how deep the economic changes are going to be. There's kind of two components to what we're all living through. There's the epidemiological and the economic. And the epidemiological will play out in its own way, but then there's the knock-on effects to the way really that we assign value to one another, which is how I think of economy. Economy isn't just about money. It's not just about jobs and wages, though that's part of it, but it's really the whole system of values. And I think anyone who's a leader, at least, and that was who we were writing for, should be anticipating that this will not just be something that blows over, but something that really changes the structure of valuation, the value that's placed on different kinds of work. Will we ever look at what we are calling now frontline workers or essential workers in quite the same way again? How will that change how we value them in the future? We've gone through this quite amazing thing where as a society, we decided to basically nuke our economy for the sake of people who are aging because of the differential risk involved in this particular bug. And we decided, you know what, we'll all stay home for the sake of people in nursing homes and in other care environments to as much as possible spare them. That's an amazing moral moment of who we value and why. And is that just going to pass, or is that actually going to really fundamentally change what we value? And of course, this does also have implications about what kind of money is available, what kind of resources are available. And I think the opportunity is to actually make intentional choices about what we're going to value going forward. What have we learned about what we didn't value before that we need to value now? What did we highly value that actually ought to be discounted in different ways? And if we take advantage of that, just as the little ice ages, don't think of glaciers covering the entire planet. They just were slight changes, shifts in the environment that caused human beings to adapt. If we adapt in creative ways, I think this is a real opportunity.
Yeah. Kristen, any thoughts on that idea and this idea of a small ice age?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a brilliant way to really think about it. It's very helpful, I think, to think about the blizzard and then the winter and then, the long-term impact of this. And I think the trauma that we're all going through, over 62,000 people have died. And these aren't statistics. These are moms. These are dads. These are grandparents. These are children. These are uncles. And, the way we haven't been able to grieve, the way we haven't been able to be there, the way, the healthcare workers have stood in from us or we've stood at the windows. I mean, the trauma of that, I think, is going to last for a long time as we deal daily with our own losses, our own grief, our disappointments of this isn't the way it's supposed to be. This isn't the way our world was supposed to be unfolding. So we are each dealing with those daily losses, but then to see, the trauma of losing so many people and knowing that we have a long way to go. In many states, we haven't flattened the curve. We're still continuing to go up. And then I guess thinking about weathering the storm. I mean, we're all facing the same storm, but our boats look very different, right? I mean, depending on our socioeconomic status, depending on our race, our ethnicity, we are experiencing this in very, very different ways. And I think what has happened over the last couple of months is it's not that anything new has happened in terms of the disparities, but there is a huge spotlight on the inequities, not only in America, in terms of healthcare and who has access, in terms of education and the equity and the fairness of those who can be educated. Even when the guidelines came down and said everyone has to wash your hands, well, what if you don't have access to a sink? And the homeless population who don't have those, huge inequities. So I think, as we begin to continue day by day to go through this, the spotlight is on these inequities. And I think there are signs of hope along the way as people dig in, as neighbors reach out, as people become creative for solutions. But I do think all of this is really going to last for a long time and really have impact for years to come.
Yeah. Dave, you think a lot about these kinds of things. Especially from a design standpoint and how kind of a design your life kind of perspective or context in kind of intersects this moment. What are your thoughts? Dave, I've got you muted.
Pardon me.
There we go.
So my partner, Bill Burnett, the executive director of the design program at Stanford, and I have been getting a surprising volume of inquiries about, hey guys, how do I design my way out of this? We've actually come up, we're partway through developing a short video clip series called Designing Your COVID Life. And frankly, we're just repeating ourselves. We don't have any new ideas or new principles. We just have a whole new context. But that context is so demanding that we're re-upping and re-entering the conversation. I was just working on this yesterday. And thing one, in designing your COVID life, is the way I put it is get real and stay free. Step zero in the design process is acceptance. And step one actually is then empathy. So the empathy table is a good place for designers to be. And then on you go. But you can't solve a problem you're not willing to have. And many people's problem isn't their problem, it's their problem with their problem. And when you got a problem with your problem, that's a problem. Because you can't solve that problem. And right now, a whole lot of people are angry, some of them standing in front of City Hall, because they don't like their problem. And they want to blame the people who are providing a solution or a response to that problem is going, well, you're my problem. So I really want my world back. In fact, I have a right to my world back, and it's your fault I don't have it. So how people are dealing with what is real is a huge issue right now. And we've often said design thinking, and I would also even, as a faith-based person, faith only works in this place called reality. Doesn't work in your head, doesn't work in the land of should, doesn't work in the land of wish. It only works in the land of is. But coming to an agreement on what the land of is actually is a little challenging. In fact, I would go double down on what Kristen and Andy were saying just now. Ice Age or otherwise. I was just reading an article by a colleague who's an economic historian at Stanford, David Kennedy, talking about this will be the fourth, in this case, the second black swan after the first depression, but that the three most determinate events in American history are the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and the Great Depression. And not World War I and II in Vietnam, and they don't make the cut in terms of changing societal structures. And the Great Depression lasted, over a decade, and stocks did not recover for 20 years. So it was a long, and the world that came back was a completely different world. And he's making the argument that absolutely this is the fourth event, and absolutely it's not going to last a while, or is it going to be? See, all that language implies return to normal.
Yes.
There's no return. There's no going back. It will be a different world. In some sectors, less different than others. One of my sons-in-law is a team lead at Netflix, and they're working their fannies off, doing great work. And I've got another daughter-in-law who used to be in charge of housekeeping at a retreat center, running in the hotel side of the business, and they laid off 90% of their staff. So where you land in this thing varies tremendously, the point Kristen was really making. So from a design point of view, the first thing we're trying to do is help people, get to reality as quickly as you can. The problem is it's so big that it's overwhelming, and people's mental and emotional receptors, particularly alone, stressed, isolated, without communal support, are unable to hear what the reality really is, much less pivot toward it. So there's sort of a reality assimilation shock that we're in the process of getting through, and a whole lot of people are wanting I like his version, I like her version. They're shopping for the pandemic of their choice. And that's a short-term fix. It's a coping system. But where we're going is to a brave new world.
If I can both push back a little bit, Dave, and also maybe take that further.
Right.
I had the misfortune of being a journalist in September 2001. And all of us who were journalists after September 11th wrote these pieces where we said, everything's changed. Like, we're never going back to normal. I wrote a piece, Miley Cyrus, I believe it was, or maybe it was Britney Spears at that time, had just danced at the MTV Music Awards wearing only a snake. And I remember writing, no one will ever do this again. Like, this sort of vapid entertainment, this exploitive entertainment. Well, the fact that I can't remember if it's Britney Spears or Miley Cyrus sums up the point. Like,
or was it last week?
I think it was Christina Aguilera.
Well, anyway, the snake I remember. So all of us who were writing then wrote these retrospectively extremely embarrassing pieces about how everything was going to change. And what was actually stunning is how quickly people wanted to snap back to normal. And what I've been thinking about, first of all, there are scenarios in which that could happen in this case to a certain extent. And a very notable example from world history is what happened in Europe and to some extent in the US after the Great War and the last great pandemic, the Spanish flu, which was the Roaring 20s. And in the Roaring 20s, there was nothing that people wanted more than to snap back to the normal they had had. But in fact, the structures had shifted underneath our societies in such a way that attempt to go back to normal actually sowed the seeds of vulnerability, hyperinflation in Germany, destabilization of institutions in Europe that led to the Second World War and also the Great Depression. And I even think after September 11th, 2001, some of the choices that America as a country made geopolitically as well as economically really were setting ourselves up for a totally new level of vulnerability because we were not actually addressing what we had learned about reality from that traumatic experience. So I think it's a little too soon to say it'll look like everything's changed, because it may look surprisingly soon like things are back to normal. But in fact, that will be this kind of manic reaction that doesn't account for what really has changed underneath us.
Yeah, I have no trouble amening all of that. And I think particularly just looking at, little things like European countries providing 75% wage guarantees versus $1,200 you're never probably going to receive because the admin will never get figured out. Makes a huge difference. And so different parts of the world, not just merely different socioeconomic, sectors, but different societies, will globalization have peaked? We need to be, is this, this is probably going to fuel populism. So I think the underlying infrastructures and the social contracts, right? What are the social contracts are a little up for grabs, and that's going to take a while to shake out.
Yeah, great points. And it's interesting because as we think about this future, and it's uncertain, unknown, and so we're all kind of winging it here as we try to, we talk about co-create that future with that uncertain foundation underneath our feet. There's a popular term in Christian lexicon, which we all know, which is flourishing. And this idea of flourishing, and I'm really intrigued and fascinated by that word in this moment of what does flourishing look like when we thought we were flourishing in the past. And so, how do we move through, especially, from kind of Christian ethos and with a more of a biblical framework, how do we move into flourishing? What do we take with us from the past that was worth holding on to? And what exciting things might we be looking forward to in this idea of flourishing? Kristen, would love to kind of have you kick off that idea.
I think there's so many incredible opportunities if we really take the opportunities and to reimagine and to ask the question, what kind of world do I want to live in? What does this look like? How can we recreate with a spotlight continuing to be on the inequities? What can we do? Where can we as people of faith stand in those gaps? And I think those are the kind of conversations we need to have. Where are the gaps? Where can we stand in the gaps? Where can we be a place where those seeds can be planted so we can begin to flourish? I think there are so many places that I think we're seeing these moments, these beautiful moments of flourishing. I think where people are seeing that and remembering that we are interconnected. I mean, remember just a couple of months ago, we were talking about how incredibly polarized we are as a country. Well, we still are polarized, and we're seeing a lot of this politicized, but kind of underneath all of that, we are seeing people remember that we are interconnected, that my life impacts, your life and your children and your, the people that you work with, and the decisions that you make impact, my life and my parents and my dad who has Alzheimer's and my sister who's working in a grocery store and my daughter who's working at a hospital and my nephew who's working, loading FedEx trucks. The decisions we individually make are not our own decisions. We are a web. We are, interconnected. And, as Christians, we've always known that, right? This is the time to start talking about that again and to live more fully into it. This is really a moment, and people are finding it. People are seeing it. But I think what we can say is give language to that, right? And say this is the community flourishing. These are examples. So those are some initial thoughts.
Yeah. Dave, as you kind of take a praxis perspective on this idea of flourishing, it's certainly an idea that in the praxis community that we talk about a lot. Any thoughts about what flourishing might look like in the future and what we bring with us from the past?
Well, yeah, I think in fact, I just did a webinar for 100 MBAs and 27 different MBA fellowships across the world last night with university. And we were talking about these kinds of things, because they want to get back to the plans they had in mind before they started their MBAs. And so back to, I think this moment, there's an invitation. I've been telling people right and left, this moment is really a walk your talk test. You actually find out who you are. Do you believe that stuff you say all the time? You know what I mean? I know I and my colleague Andy, we say a lot of stuff. I say stuff all day long. And do I buy it? Do I mean it? So when I say flourishing, what do I mean by flourishing? Now, frankly, do I really mean, outcomes that feel pretty fun and cool and sexy and interesting and growth-minded? That's what flourishing looks like. Or is flourishing bringing full aliveness and presence as a person fully connected into participating with the divine at any moment in time in the place and in the moment where I found myself incarnately standing? So for instance, I'm finding myself going to, from a faith point of view, 2 Corinthians 4. We're hard pressed on every side, yet not crushed. We're perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Now that's familiar territory. But I think there's an important theological grounding underneath all that. Prosperity gospelers don't hang out in this passage much. And the reason being, I think it's fair. Now, Andy's a bit of exegetical theologian than am I, but I think it's fair to conclude that this tells us God never promised to fix it. Because you're getting hard pressed, you're getting perplexed, you're getting persecuted, you're getting struck down. But you are not destroyed and you are not despairing. So there is a promise to be with you, but there is not necessarily a promise to fix it. So I think step one of flourishing right now is to deeply accept the moment that we're in. And then in so doing, saying, okay, what is the invitation I'm supposed to be responding to right now that's compassionate. Because I think sometimes as we zoom to opportunity, let's not forget, Lamentations is in the Bible too, that we want to be present to the pain that's going on, and be appropriate in our response, so that the flourishing we're moving into is an honest one, not just trying to run across the fire swamp as quick as we can and make a cool new camp on the other side. Because if we do that, we're going to leave a bunch of people behind. And I think the trick is going to be, based on Kristen's point, to capture the opportunity for some corrective, for some redemptiveness, some increased justice and equality, equitability, not just equality, but equitability, because there's going to be some change agency available. There's going to be some flexibility, we hope, that I could snap back to, I want to get mine back, right? So we could get much more selfish, or we can get a little bit more compassionate. And I think that's a pivot. And by the way, there's Christian language for either way. We can language this thing very selfishly if you're not careful, and it'll sound Christian. But I think the idea of being people who are moving toward, the beloved community, at this moment, and being an agent of change in that's the tricky invitation and the tricky agency to try to find. I'm not sure what that looks like.
Andy, you have written about and talked about so much and think about culture. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on what a flourishing culture looks like.
Yeah, I've always had an uneasy relationship with this word. So I wrote a book that has flourishing in the subtitle. It's called Strong and Weak. And so I'm not totally averse to it, but I have always felt like it only tells half the truth, or it lends itself so easily to misunderstanding. So it's so easily conflated with affluence. So having many options, having a certain kind of privilege and protection,
fulfillment.
It's just, and that's such not the way that Scripture seems to speak about full humanity. And so you were getting at this, Dave, and when Jesus describes the people who actually encountered the Son of Man, as he puts it, they encountered him in the form of people who were naked, who were sick, who were in prison. And he says, you either met me there or not, or, well, you all met me there, but some of you, recognized me or responded to me in a human way. So I've been, this is maybe a little askew from your question, Christy, but I've been thinking, partly because of the gift, such as it is, of the daily lectionary that I happen to be reading through, the daily readings that happen to be in Jeremiah for me this past week. I don't know who put Jeremiah in Easter season, but there it is. And Jeremiah is, if your picture of flourishing can't include Jeremiah, you're in trouble, because Jeremiah is a really important figure in the history of God's people. And he's like the least happy human being who ever lived, because he has the strange calling of serving 3 kings in a row of the southern kingdom of Israel, none of whom listen to him, all of whom make disastrous, in we'd say today, foreign policy choices. But he sees it as disastrous choices of who they worship, who they serve, whether they do justice or not, which leads, of course, to what he foresees before anyone else in some ways, which is the exile of the southern kingdom crushed under the hand of the emperor of Babylon. And if you can't fit Jeremiah in, you don't have a full picture of what it is to be human. And yet, and Jeremiah is not happy. He gets thrown in a cistern at one point. He calls he himself calls God a deceitful brook, like a wadi in the Middle East that sometimes flows with water, but much of the year is just totally dry. And yet, even in Jeremiah, there's these two kind of contradictory things. On the one hand, he writes to the exiles and he says, I want you to actually plant gardens in this city. The exiles are out over there in Babylon singing Psalm 137. By the waters of Babylon, we laid down our harps. We wept when we remembered Zion. We were flourishing back in Zion, but here we sing, how can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? And that psalm has one of the worst passages in the Bible where the psalmist prays for the children of the Babylonians to be dashed against the rocks and have their brains, blown out, basically, such as the outrage and disorientation and confusion. And Jeremiah writes these people and says, actually, plant gardens, buy houses, consummate marriages, and pray for the welfare of the city that you're in, which we really could translate, pray for the shalom, the flourishing of the city that you're in. So in this worst case scenario, pray for that environment. And then he does this other thing where he takes this field as the Babylonian armies are approaching, and he buys it and signs a deed, which is about to become legally null and void because the civil law of Israel is about to evaporate. And he sends word of this to the people in Babylon and says, houses and fields will be bought in this land again. And he has this long-term vision for restoration. This is so un-American to think and talk this way, it seems to me. And yet this is the daily reality of people all around the world, including those who share the Christian faith that matters to all of us. Lots of people live in exile. Lots of people are homeless. Lots of people have every reason to utter imprecations against the violent and powerful around them. And if your account of flourishing doesn't include all those people and all those experiences and God's intention and presence in those places, you need a bigger Bible, I guess. You need to restore some pages to your Bible.
That's well said. I'm obviously gonna have to spend some more time in Jeremiah.
It's not always fun, I can tell you.
I bet. Since we're talking today about co-creation, and I think in some ways you all have touched on this in some way, but there's this concept of sacrifice. And I think if there's any time in kind of modern history where sacrifice is becoming more and more of a conversation, something that we all have to start considering in different ways, it's now. Certainly in our lifetimes, for sure. And I wonder if you all have thought at all about how sacrifice might look differently in the future, how we might be applying it differently in the future, how we might be thinking about its role in our lives, especially as the church. Andy, if you don't mind, I'd love to kick it to you. Many who are listening will not know or may not have been at the summit last May where you talked about this third way of sacrifice, which was so influential and inspirational to me. And so I'm wondering if, as you've thought about sacrifice, what are we learning about this concept and how will it change in many ways the way maybe we are co-creating this future?
Yeah. Well, very briefly, maybe to set it up, I would say I always want to dispel a potential misimpression when we talk about sacrifice, which is sometimes sacrifice can be thought of as something that's extracted from people, like people are made to sacrifice. This group will have to sacrifice so that others can, ... When we think about sacrifice in a more biblical framework, it's a willing offering that resets a relationship in some way. And the way that I think about it is partly by drawing on game theory, and at least most of us are familiar with the kind of most basic idea of game theory, which is win-lose games, where I win, you lose, or win-win games. And there are games that we can actually play where we both play in such a way that we're better off after one round than we were before. And sacrifice actually has a different logic. It's the phrase that we use for it at Praxis is, I sacrifice, we win. So rather than I win, you lose, or I win, you win, I go first, we might say, in the game, and I give up something that I would not have to give up. But in doing so, I change the terms of the game such that we're now bound together and we are now a we. The classic game theory treats the actors as sort of atomized individuals who all play and then walk away. But the reality of social life and the reality of relationship is when we play well, you could say, when we play the game of life well together, we actually become more and more bound to one another. And one of the main ways we bond to one another is actually through sacrifice, through my sort of unilaterally giving something up that I might not have had to give up, that causes you to realize, oh, we're not playing a win-lose game. We're not playing a one-up, one-down game. This person is actually so trusting of me and in some ways of the environment that we're in, that they're willing to just freely, I mean, going back to a kind of a biblical framework, take their best lamb, like the one, usually the firstborn is generally, often in agriculture, the healthiest, the one that you want to preserve and perhaps breed for the next generation. And instead, they're actually going to willingly give that up because they exist in this environment of trust, or the biblical word would be covenant, that allows them to give something up. And that changes the game, and it binds us to one another. So that's what we could be seeing opportunities for. And I do think that with much fits and starts and a lot of complexity, in a way, our society is going through kind of an experiment in sacrifice, where we sacrifice many of our freedoms for the sake of others. And could it be that that will bind us to one another in new ways? That would be the best case scenario coming out of this.
Dave, your thoughts on sacrifice as you think about the future, this uncertain future we're entering into, but the sacrifices maybe even that we are making now, as Andy reflected on, how that may change what the future looks like. You're muted again.
There's low table stakes sacrifice, high table stakes, there's conceptual. Let me talk. So there are a lot of ways to come at the question of sacrifice. But I think if I'll riff on where Andy was going a little bit further, sort of even in my design your COVID life, my second bullet is manage mindset. Mindset really matters. That's a strong Christian principle, be transformed with the renewing of your mind, and the double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Where you're coming from matters. Whatever's true, whatever's lovely, whatever's good repute, if there's any excellence, so let your mind dwell on these things. And then, peace happens, as opposed to don't think over here. That's when unpeace happens. So, long before Seligman and positive psychology, the wisdom traditions, particularly Christianity, has known that your mind matters. So is your heart, but I'm not trying to go there for the moment. But on that mindset, there's the fundamental issue of individualism versus community. So am I an I, or am I part of a we? Mm-hmm. So I would argue there's sort of an existential sacrifice at a question of fundamental definition of who I am as a person that this moment could invite me to revisit. Literally, Andy made the point earlier that, whether people realize this or not, a whole lot of people who are not terribly exposed are staying home so that those who are exposed don't die. And, we have shut down the economy, I live at the beach. I'm literally on the coast here in Santa Cruz, California. They completely shut the beaches down the Wednesday before Easter weekend, trying to signal to everybody, don't relieve your cabin fever in our little town. That worked well. It was $1,000 fine to go surfing. Yeah, put your foot on the sand, $1,000, and some people paid it. And then they relinquished on that to hopefully they'd slowed people down. And last weekend it got warm and everybody drove down again, so they just re-upped the rules again. It's now illegal to be on the beach between 11 and 5 on the weekend, i.e., people who don't live here go away. And why are we saying that? Well, we're saying, look, I'm the county health officer, and I'm saying this is a shared resource called the beach, and you may want to come here, but you do not deserve to come here at the expense of your neighbor who you might be a transmission fomite agent to unknowingly. So your personal freedom is going to radically constrain because the we has an impact. And people are really pushing against that. What they're pushing against is, no, my I deserves its due at the expense of you. And if you get sick, well, then let them die and deplete the surplus population. But the Scrooges are running around whether they know it or not. So at the sacrifice level, what I call the freedom of constraint, am I willing to literally enter into this moment, or to wherever I happen to be, whichever, empowered or disempowered sub-constituency I'm in, am I willing to view it first and foremost as all God's ever asked of me is to enter into this shared moment. And if I'm going to co-create with the spirit and co-create with one another, then we're going to co-create because we are a we. And what I have to say doesn't actually matter. What about mine? Thanks for sharing. What about ours is the question. So the first sacrifice is giving up the I for the we at a level that will, I think, be greater. And so personal freedom is going to constrain collective safety and security, and hopefully some thriving is going to hopefully try to go back up again. That's going to be a bona fide culture war. So I think the first, I would say, from a sacrificial point of view, the first sacrifice is giving up the I.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's powerful. Kristen, what Dave just said makes me think about your work with civil dialogue and, this idea of freedom of speech. And, we're seeing that a lot, certainly, as we have some individuals who think that it's time to open up society again, and others who are wanting to just continue to hunker down. And in some ways, it's a dialogue that's happening. I would love to hear your thoughts about how that dialogue is going. Is it productive? And is there something about sacrifice that sits in the midst of this dialogue that is happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably one of the most difficult things for Americans, right? We're ruggedly individualistic, and this is part of who we are. And so to have to kind of sacrifice me for you, wait a second, that doesn't really sit well. I have my freedoms, and I want my freedoms. I want my rights, and yet I what all of this is doing is seeing how radically interconnected that we actually are. We can't walk into a grocery store without realizing that if we don't wear a mask, we could be infecting someone who, and that could, the virus could then go back to that household. And I mean, we are interconnected. And so I think it's this sacrifice we have to at least sit and consider is, what does it mean that I am so interconnected? And does that mean that I need to give up living in my little silo? We all love our silos. We do. And in all the dialogue work that I've done over, the last many, many years, is that discomfort when people realize that to really understand a different perspective, right? To really connect with someone who has a very different perspective of the world, that they have to open up and in a way give up that protective wall of, this is my silo, this is the way I see the world, this is my perspective, to realize that. And Christy, this is so much of the work that the empathy table is doing and Ideos is doing, is to say, this is one lens of the world, but I do not see the full world until I see and understand your lens. So the rich opportunity here is to be able to begin the conversation of, tell me the world that you see. How do you experience the world? And that is all about empathy. That's about listening. And, I think listening deeply, and not to get ready for your own comeback. Well, but this is my view.
Yes.
Listening deeply. And I had one of my teachers, mentors once tell me that if you are listening, truly listening to the person, then they are the most important person in the entire world in that moment. And that you are not listening unless that's the way you are seeing that person. They're the only person that matters in that moment. So that deep listening, and also then that believing them, even if you haven't had that experience, right? It's trusting that what they are saying, that their view, their perspective for them is just as true as yours is for you, But while you're doing that, you're building that relationship. And I think in that relationship and that interconnectedness, even if you disagree, you can begin to see these moments of, this is where we have this in common. And then that's the beauty. That's the moment of transition.
Kristen,
That's the moment of transformation. That's the moment where grace can happen.
Brian Stevenson at Equal Justice Initiative talks about proximity. He talks about four things that are just going to help us bridge these gaps and bring justice back. And one of them is get proximate. He talks a lot about getting proximate. Now, so if you're facilitating these conversations across divides, well, in order to hear each other and be close enough to listen to you, I've got to get to you. Can you talk a little bit about getting people to be willing to get close enough to listen? Because proximity, can we literally come together?
And that's the hard work, right? That's the hard work. I've been telling Christy about a dialogue that we've been engaged and I've been helping to facilitate around guns and violence. And so it took us literally 4 months to find 15 individuals from as many different perspectives and experiences to be willing to come together as a group to talk about guns and violence. And you notice I say guns and violence because we could not put those words together in any other way. And so someone from the NRA, someone who is a farmer and uses a gun as a tool, someone whose loved one killed themselves, committed suicide with a gun, someone who is afraid to send her kids to school every single day because she's afraid of a mass shooting, and on and on and on. So we tried very, very hard, but it took 4 months to do that. But it was worth it because within our dialogue circles, we have been able to really do some incredible work together, to listen to each other's stories, to really understand not only what we believe, but why and what's at stake. And who are the voices that we listen to growing up? What's helped shape our opinion? So it's enabled us to do all of that hard work, and we're still in the middle of it. But the goal is, hopefully, how can we find those pieces of common ground where we can imagine a world together where we can live together in safety? And what does that look like? And is there legislation around that? But it's been tremendously hard because usually you put out a call and everyone who's interested in, comes and, it's like you're preaching to the choir, right?
Yes, exactly.
That's not where the hard work needs to be done. So that's an example anyway.
Christy, I wonder if that points out a tension that the COVID moment creates for exactly that issue. So here we all are sheltering in place. I'm isolated.
Completely.
My wife and I, we have 8 grandchildren. We can't pick any of them up. And it's making my wife crazy. So when, if and when, the new normal reverts to something kind of like the old normal, we, like a lot of people I know, want to run back to have empathy with my own kind. I want, I've been deprived of my people. I've been deprived of my lifestyle. And what I want back is I want my preferred stuff back. So that's like going the other way. I mean, is there a Christian indictment here that says, well, do you notice the reason we're all experiencing this? Because we really are all in this together. It's not just on the radio ad. We are literally all in this together. Oh, who are all those people that I was ignoring before, and my lifestyle has now been manipulated to care for? And so when I go back, how do I go back more inclusively, not less inclusively? I could literally become even more exclusive because I'm so desperate to get back mine, when what I really want to do is run the other direction. Is there some kind of an imprimatur here for us to make this a prophetic moment to shift the direction and say, yeah, when you come out of your cave, come out a very different way than you went in?
I think that's exactly where we need to be. And I think that's where the church needs to be. I think we need to be in the gap. And I think that's what we need to talk about. I mean, if we talk about the body of Christ, right? Our body of Christ is really broken. It is. And so how do we bring that back together? And I think this is an incredible opportunity to are we willing to sacrifice to make that happen? And there are a lot of sacrifices. But I think as we talk about, the Christian community, we have for eons, we've been talking about it. We talk about the body of Christ. Well, this is the moment, right? This is an incredible moment in history. There have been other moments in history, but this is an incredible moment for us to be able to model that. And I think it's going to take incredible leadership. I think it's going to take incredible courage to do that. But I think it starts by looking at who's around the table and who's having the conversations and who's missing. And we need to get the people, the voices, the experiences, the perspectives that are missing around that table. That's where we need to start. And we can do that right now.
No, I love that, Kristen. It's almost this idea of reconciling the brokenness, which you allude to, this body that's been broken. How do we start to put that back together? Especially at a time where there's tremendous fear, tremendous concern, and in the midst of tremendous polarization that existed before COVID-19 ever showed up. And as people, governments, thought leaders, institutions grapple with how we emerge from this well, I think the church has a very specific voice and a very specific perspective to speak into that. And I would love for any of you, as you feel led to kind of respond to this idea of what are the most critical challenges we can learn as the church in this moment, and how do we move forward, kind of reconciling the brokenness that currently exists.
Andy, you sometimes tell pastors what to do. If a bunch of pastors got together and said, "Hey, Andy, what should we be preaching about the next couple of months?" You're the culture making kind of guy. You're the partner for theology and culture at practice. I mean, if we want to have a more redemptive response to this, and church world, church pretty well. What would your hope or what would your wish for church leadership be right now?
Oh man. Well, here's the thought that comes to mind, and it really emerged out of what Kristen was saying, which I think had so many layers that were profound. I am really struck at how small our circles have had to be for most of us, a month and counting, during the lockdown phase. And in that time, you inevitably, I think, restrict your circle. It's not a moment when you go, if I'm a gun owner, I'm not like spending my time during COVID-19 going to look for some, gun control advocate to become friends with. I mean, it's very hard to build trust virtually, for one thing. So all of us, I think, have seen our circles get smaller. All of us are stuck with a few people in person, if we're fortunate to have a few to shelter with. Here's the kind of counterintuitive thought I have. I think if I were a pastor, I would be, once we get out of the lockdown, I would be doing a retrospective series on what we learned about ourselves and our own spiritual vulnerabilities in the midst of this experience. And one of the things we'd have to talk about is how hard it is to live with other people, because we have some evidence. I'm not sure how validated it is, but there's some reason to believe that in Wuhan and Hubei province, the divorce rate went up tremendously in the wake of the lockdowns there. All of us have had all kinds of difficulty exposed the past few weeks, living just with a few other people. And these are people that we feel some affinity for. They're, at least some responsibility to, and maybe at one point we wanted to marry one of those people or whatever. And what it uncovers is the fallacy that if I can find people who are similar enough to me and who I'm bound to by enough bonds of loyalty, that life will be easy. And the real problem is those other people out there somewhere. And this is actually what I think of as the Pharisaic distortion. And the Pharisees were a complex movement in Judaism. But what Jesus encountered in the Pharisees was a strain of thought that said, we can purify the people of God down to the truly righteous, only associate with them, only literally share tables with them. Like they literally did not sit down at a table unless you were inside that circle. And then we'll be good. And the discovery, Jesus coming into the midst of that system actually reveals that there's actually incredible evil that's latent within even the most self-consciously pure community, that actually they'll go and conspire with their sworn enemies, the Sadducees, to destroy Jesus. Because what does Jesus threaten? He threatens the idea that we have a circle of purity that we can get inside and then be safe and provided for. And we've all experienced a tremendous narrowing of our circles, and we found that inside that circle, we are still as broken, as prone to selfishness, all kinds of things, as we were outside of it. And ideally, we would come out of this with a kind of compassion, first of all, in a sense, for ourselves, our sinful, messed up selves, and then less sure that what we need is more people like us. And that would be a really interesting sermon series. Like, what did you learn about living with people very much like you, your family, your spouse, your children, and what does that teach us about what it takes actually to live with every other human? Which I'm really struck by the thread in this conversation that the ultimate sacrifice is the sacrifice of protecting me. It's the sacrifice of keeping my ego at the center. Am I willing to let you be the most important person? That's like the most fundamental sacrifice. And that's what we've all struggled with for the past few weeks. And maybe that can teach us something about how to live differently in the future.
Yes. Well said. Well said. Well, I appreciate this dialogue. I wish this conversation could go on, but I actually have a final question for all of you. So a little bit tapping into your prophetic, the prophetic parts of yourselves. But if we move through this crisis well, which we all pray we do, what does a co-created and redemptive future look like? And what can we start doing now to seed that future? Kristen, would you mind kicking us off on that very easy question?
I think, I see a future where we are inspired. Let me just kind of go to a piece of scripture that I've been grappling with, and maybe this will help, or maybe if it doesn't, you can cut this part of the conversation out. But I've been thinking so much about the road to Emmaus, right? And thinking about how, the disciples were walking on this road and the road was so hard and they didn't recognize Jesus. And why didn't they recognize Jesus? Why were their faces kept from seeing? And I see that as, in this moment of grief, and for many of us, we can't see beyond that grief, right? But as we travel on the road, and as they did, they stopped and had supper, and it was in that very simple breaking of the bread, right? Breaking of the bread that they recognized God, and it was in the simplicity of breaking and giving and sharing and blessing and saying thank you that God's love was present. And I think there's such an amazing lesson to learn from that is the simple things that we do, the simple things. We have a lot of really hard structural work to do, and absolutely, and that's going to take years, and I think we need to do that. But we also need to recognize that God's love can be recognized and felt in the very, very simple tasks of feeding, of being present, of listening, of understanding, of sharing, of saying thank you. And I think that's kind of where we need to start. So if we can start with that, then I think we can move to those bigger places where we need to go.
Yes.
I think if I had a longing or a hope, Christy, that's kind of the way I heard your question. It would. I like Andy's sermon series idea. To help people to reside into that sense of loss, and the evidence making of our own foibledness, right? Recognizing what jerks we all are at the end of the day, and as we come back, that difficulty in living together outs how much energy I put into orchestrating outcomes that match my preferences. My life is overwhelmingly organized around my preferences. And in fact, we define flourishing as you get a high preference rate. That's what you were saying earlier, Andy. And
Yes.
hey, how was it today? I got what I wanted. How was it today? I got close to the reality of where God is. And so my hope would be that there's some movement, some pivoting where our core question moves away from preference and toward presence. And that presence is in the proximity of what's the reality in front of me. How can I be present to what's actually happening here? Not just how can I engineer here to look like what I want, but how can I be fully where here already is? Because that's where God is, including that other, including that compromise, including that sacrifice, including that difficulty of that person I stayed home to help not kill. Well, now that I didn't kill him, why am I willing to hang out with him? And I'm glad you're not dead. Now go away. Give me back my golf players. I think moving from preference to presence, and that became a deep heart long. What do I want today? I want to be where I want to be where God is. That could start becoming my first longing, not my second, not my third or fourth.
Love that.
So good.
Andy, you want to send us home?
Well, there's just much to ponder, and it's very humbling to think about how far I am from being any of what we really need in the world. And in addition to what Kristen and Dave said, I do think, coming out of this, any of us who can build bridges of trust need to be investing in building them. Because I think we've discovered how quickly the drawbridges go up, even as there's a tremendous hunger for connection right now. And somebody has to be willing to actually build the bridge. And, in a sense, like on this conversation, even Christy, you played this role. Two of us know one another well. Dave and I have worked together, but we hadn't worked with Kristen. You have. You know us. You built a bridge, right, in inviting this group of four, along with Alyssa, your assistant, who helped it to happen. And this conversation happens because you built something based on trust that you had. You created the possibility of trust for others, and that's the basic move of social change, I think. And it's specifically when it crosses boundaries that otherwise would not be crossed, that folks we would never get on a Zoom call with on our own, and eventually people who we'd never sit around a table with again on our own. Somebody has to set the table, and if not us, who?
It's a beautiful way to end. I so appreciate all three of you. This has been an incredible conversation. Like I said, we could go on for hours just exploring what this future could look like, and how we can all participate in it. But I'm so thankful that you all have at least participated in this early beginning of the seeding process. So thanks so much. Glad you guys all know each other now.
So great.
And I'll be talking to
you guys.
Great to be with you all.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I want to thank our guests, Andy Crouch, Kristen Farrington, and Dave Evans, for an inspiring and thought-provoking conversation, and for kicking off our Food for Thought series. We hope you will continue to join us for the entire 8 episodes in our Food for Thought series that are uploaded weekly on the Ideos website and our YouTube channel. You can also find the audio version of this conversation on any of the podcast platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. We want to thank you for joining us and hope to see you on our next episode.